Καλησπέρα. Καλώς ήρθατε. Πριν αρχίσουμε, να σας πω ότι υπάρχουν ακουστικά και υπάρχει διερμηνία ταυτόχρονη. Για όσους δεν έχετε πάρει, είναι ακριβώς γύρω-γύρω από την αίθουσα. Οπότε, αν κάποιος θέλει, μπορεί να σηκωθεί τώρα και να πάρει τα ακουστικά του. Θα περιμένουμε 1-2 λεπτάκια για να γίνει και αυτή η διαδικασία και να ξεκινήσουμε.
Αγγλικά και ελληνικά. Οπότε όποιος δεν γνωρίζει αγγλικά, καλό θα ήταν να πάει να πάρει τον διερμηνέα, τέλος πάντων, τον μηχανικό. Έχω πλήρη οπτική επαφή με τον άλλον. That's true. No, Hollinghurst is much more.
Today. See you tomorrow morning.
Okay, since we are the last event, we can take like 10 minutes after.
Yes, because we're starting.
We are the after event, you know. Τέλεια, νομίζω ότι μπορούμε να αρχίσουμε. Να δώσουμε πρώτα το λόγο στον άλλον να πει την υπόθεση εδώ και μετά να πω εγώ την εισαγωγή της θέσης. Να πω κάτι και θα το δώσω. Τέλεια.
Καλησπέρα. Το φετινό μας θέμα, η φετινή μας θεματική στο φεστιβάλ, στο 5ο Φεστιβάλ Βιβλίου Χανίων, είναι «Κόσμοι σε σύγκρουση». Και αν το σκεφτεί κανείς, νομίζω ότι δεν υπάρχει ιδανικότερος καλεσμένος για να ανοίξουμε αυτή την σπουδαία συζήτηση από τον απόψινό μας προσκεκλημένο. Διότι στα βιβλία του οι συγκρούσεις δεν γίνονται με θόρυβο, δεν γίνονται με όπλα, αλλά είναι εσωτερικές. Πολλές φορές είναι συγκρούσεις που γίνονται ψιθυριστά μέσα σε αριστοκρατικά σαλόνια, πίσω από κλειδωμένες πόρτες και ανάμεσα σε διαφορετικές κοινωνικές τάξεις. Καλωσορίζουμε στα Χανιά τον Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ. Κύριε Χόλινγκχερστ, καλώς ήρθατε.
Thank you.
Πριν δώσω το λόγο σε εσάς, να πω ότι είναι ο αγαπημένος συνάδελφος και όχι μόνο συνάδελφος, αλλά και υπεύθυνος της ξένης λογοτεχνίας των εκδόσεων Καστανιώτη, Γρηγόρης Μπέκος, μαζί μας. Γρηγόρη, καλώς ήρθες.
Καλώς σας βρήκαμε και φέτος. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ για την πρόσκληση.
Σερ Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ. Επειδή πρέπει να σας λέω Σερ, διότι νομίζω το 25 ο βασιλιάς Κάρολος σας έχρισε υπότι.
He did, yes, to everybody's surprise. It was a very extraordinary thing. I'd never been offered an honor of any kind and didn't expect one, you know. My first thought was that writers should not accept honors. And then I thought, well, this is a new Labour government, which 2 years ago we were placing a great deal of hope. It's proved to be rather a disappointment. And they're trying to make a signal that they want to reward an author who's been writing about queer issues, something I think the Conservative government before them would not have done. And various friends persuaded me that I should accept, so I did. But I forget about it, actually, and I'm always very startled when someone says, "Oh, it's Sir Άλαν," and I think, who's Sir Άλαν? It hasn't really become part of me.
Λοιπόν, ο λόγος στον Γρηγόρη τώρα, για να μας εισάγει κάπως στη σπουδαία περίπτωση του Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ.
Λοιπόν, θα πω 2 λόγια σύντομα για τον Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ, ο οποίος είναι, βέβαια, να πω ότι φέτος στο Φεστιβάλ Βιβλίου Χανίων, σε μια προφεστιβαλική εκδήλωση, είχε τη χαρά να έχει ένα Νόμπελ και ακολούθως σήμερα τη χαρά να έχει ένα βραβείο Booker, που το θεωρώ πάρα πολύ σημαντικό επίσης. Ο Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ, λίγο για τη ζωή του και τα βιβλία του, τα οποία δεν είναι πολλά για 40 χρόνια περίπου, θα τα συζητήσουμε αυτά. Ο Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ γεννήθηκε το 1954 στο Στράουτ της Κομιτείας του Gloucestershire, στην νοτιοδυτική Αγγλία. Σπούδασε αγγλική φιλολογία στο Magdalen College της Οξφόρδης και για πάρα πολλά χρόνια εργάστηκε στην πολύ έγκριτη επιθεώρηση για το βιβλίο στη Βρετανία, το Times Literary Supplement, από το 1982 μέχρι το 1995. Το 1993 συμπεριλήφθηκε στη λίστα ενός επίσης έγκριτου περιοδικού στη Βρετανία, του Γκράντα, όπου τον κατέταξαν στους σημαντικότερους νέους συγγραφείς τότε της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας. Έχει εκδώσει μέχρι σήμερα 7 μυθιστορήματα, μεταξύ των οποίων ξεχωρίζει η γραμμή της ομορφιάς, The Line of Beauty, που το 2004 τιμήθηκε με το βραβείο Booker. Θα αναφερθώ λίγο στα βιβλία του Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ, τα οποία, όπως είπα, δεν είναι πολλά, θεωρητικά βέβαια, θα το συζητήσουμε μαζί του. Σε περίπου 40 χρόνια έχει εκδώσει 7 μυθιστορήματα. Το πρώτο ήταν το 1988, με τίτλο The Swimming Pool Library, η βιβλιοθήκη της πισίνας. Ακολούθησαν το 1994 το Folding Star. Αυτό έχει βγει παλαιότερα στα ελληνικά με τον τίτλο Τα σκοτεινά μονοπάτια του έρωτα. Ακολούθησε το The Spell το 1998. Έχει βγει επίσης παλαιότερα στα ελληνικά με τον τίτλο Η Έλξη. Μετά είναι το The Line of Beauty, η γραμμή της ομορφιάς, το 2004. Το 2011 The Stranger's Child, το παιδί του ξένου. Το 2017 είναι το μυθιστόρημα The Spársoltl Affair, για το οποίο είναι η αφορμή για την οποία είναι σήμερα εδώ μαζί μας. Και το 2024 το πιο πρόσφατο, το 7ο, με τίτλο Our Evenings. Στα ελληνικά κυκλοφορούν, έχουν κυκλοφορήσει από τις εκδόσεις Καστανιώτη η βιβλιοθήκη της πισίνας, το παιδί του ξένου, η υπόθεση Σπάρσολτ, μεταφρασμένο από τον Ορφέα Πέργη το μυθιστόρημα αυτό, και θα πάρει τη σειρά του και το Our Evenings στη συνέχεια. Ο Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ έχει λάβει πολλά βραβεία, το βραβείο Somerset Maugham, το βραβείο E.M. Forster, γραμμάτων και τεχνών της Αμερικανικής Ακαδημίας, το βραβείο James Tate Black Memorial Prize for Fiction. Το 2025, και αυτό έχει ένα ενδιαφέρον, τιμήθηκε με το βραβείο David Cohen Prize στη Βρετανία. Αυτό εσωτερικά οι Βρετανοί και οι Ιρλανδοί το θεωρούν το Νόμπελ, ας πούμε, της περιοχής, έτσι το προσεγγίζουν. Και επίσης την ίδια χρονιά, όπως είπε η Κυριακή, χρήστηκε υπότιτλοι από τον βασιλιά Κάρολο της Αγγλίας, ο Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ. Και θα πω γιατί θεωρώ ότι είναι πολύ σημαντική περίπτωση στη σύγχρονη λογοτεχνία, γιατί αφενός είναι ένας συγγραφέας που με το πρώτο βιβλίο κατάφερε την γκέι θεματική να την πάει στο mainstream, ας πούμε, δηλαδή να αφορά όλους τους αναγνώστες αυτού του είδους η λογοτεχνία, μια λογοτεχνία πολύ υψηλού επίπεδου και απαιτητική. Και το δεύτερο είναι γιατί ο Χόλινγκχερστ μέσα σε αυτά κοντά 40 χρόνια έχει καταφέρει μέσα από το πρίσμα μιας συγκεκριμένης ευαισθησίας να μιλάει για όλη την κοινωνία από όλες τις απόψεις. Ακόμα και στενά την πολιτική διάσταση των πραγμάτων στην βρετανική κοινωνία. Τώρα θα δώσω ξανά το λόγο στην Κυριακή και στην πορεία ο καθένας θα ανακρίνουμε όσο καλύτερα μπορούμε τον Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ.
Συμφωνείτε με όλα αυτά που είπε μόλις ο Γρηγόρης?
Well, he listed all my books accurately, and he was very flattering. Yes, so I guess, yes.
Θα κάνουμε όπως και εσείς κάνατε στο τελευταίο σας βιβλίο. Θα διακτηνιζόμαστε στο χρόνο από την μία εποχή στην άλλη, προσπαθώντας να φωτίσουμε κάποιους σταθμούς της συγγραφικής σας πορείας. Ωστόσο, θα ξεκινήσουμε με το τελευταίο βιβλίο που το διαβάζουν τώρα οι Έλληνες αναγνώστες, την Υπόθεση Σπάρσολτ. Λοιπόν, είναι ένα βιβλίο για ένα πολύ μεγάλο σκάνδαλο. Το κεντρικό σκάνδαλο όμως του βιβλίου, που καταστρέφει τη δημόσια εικόνα του ήρωα, του David, στη δεκαετία του 60, δεν περιγράφεται ποτέ άμεσα. Συνεχώς υπονοείται. Και θα ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω πώς αποφασίσατε να χτίσετε ένα ολόκληρο μυθιστόρημα γύρω από ένα γεγονός που ουσιαστικά μένει αόρατο. για τον αναγνώστη.
Well, there's a slight delay, which is fine. I think my natural aptitude is not for action, and I've tended to my earlier novel, The Stranger's Child, my original idea was that it would be a book about the First World War, which would not have the First World War in it, and you would start with a group of people before the First World War in 1913. You would rejoin them in the 1920s, those who had survived, and the reader would be left to work out a lot of the things that had happened in between. I think as I've got older, I've been more and more fascinated by writing about long periods of time. And my last 3 books have all had time spans of at least 60 years. And so the crucial question for any writer of selection became very important. And these are books which are written really in episodes which absorb the reader in the life of the characters at a particular moment, and then jump, sometimes 30 years, into the future. And I think the reader enjoys that sense of disorientation at the beginning of a new section, of having to work out what the hell has happened in between, where we are, who these people are. And it seemed to me quite an interesting way of dramatizing the change and the sort of ironies of time. If I were to describe that whole period, I would end up writing something like Proust, you know. The question of omission, I think, is something I've always enjoyed playing with. In this case, yes, it was a scandal. I wanted this scandal, which is a sexual scandal. It's a married man who, for mysterious but I think understandable reasons, gets caught up in a gay sex exposure in 1966 or 1967. Just before, 1967 is a crucial date in British social history because it was the date of the Sexual Offences Act, which partially decriminalised homosexuality. I think I wanted a certain amount of mystery anyway to surround this main character, David Spársoltl, who we first see at Oxford during the war, and he comes from a quite different social background from the rather upper middle class people who are in the same college as him. And he's very, very handsome and athletic. His ambition is to go into the Air Force. And Oxford at this time was a very strange, I mean, I loved exploring Oxford in that period of the war when students might come up just for 1 year, just do a very short degree, and then they would go away into the army. So he attracts a lot of attention by his sort of physical prowess and a certain sexual flexibility is suggested in his behaviour, which is not a flaw, but in the context of English social life and law, it becomes one. And I think I wanted this scandal. We jumped from a period in the 1926, I think, to the 1960s. And during that time, David has had a son who becomes the principal figure in the rest of the book. So this son is growing up under the shadow of this mysterious thing, which of course is not talked about. And I think this is the other thing that I've always been very fascinated by. It's not only a British thing, but it certainly is a big British thing of not really talking about things that are important. And I remember, I think everybody is perhaps the same. There is a famous scandal, and then 5 years later, you can't quite remember what it was. Who was it did what? It was, and it recedes in time, and the name would bring, so someone said Spársoltl, and someone would say, oh yes, that was, what was it? But you can't quite remember. And I feel there were various scandals like that in my childhood, political scandal, sexual scandal. And the biggest one, of course, was the Profumo affair, which sort of almost brought down a government. Yes, I wanted to have that mysterious ambience. And actually, now you've got me going. This touches on another theme which I've got more and more interested in, of the impossibility of really knowing what goes on in private between other people. Those are some of the reasons, I think, that I veiled it in a certain amount of mystery.
Θέλω να πω ότι πραγματικά τον David Σπάρσολτ τον περιγράφεται, είναι ερωτεύσιμος τόσο πολύ για όλα τα φύλλα. Όταν το διάβαζα, λέω είναι πανέμορφος. Τον περιγράφεται πανέμορφο και πολύ ποθητό. Ωστόσο, στο πρώτο μέρος του βιβλίου, που ονομάζεται «Το σκότος της Οξφόρδης» και διαδραματίζεται κατά τη διάρκεια του Δευτέρου Παγκοσμίου Πολέμου, οι ήρωές σας, ο Ντέιβιτ και ο Ιαν, πρέπει να κρατούν τις επιθυμίες τους στο απόλυτο σκοτάδι. Για τους γνωστούς λόγους, στο τέλος του βιβλίου, όπου εμείς γνωρίζουμε περισσότερο το γιο του Ντέιβιτ, τον Τζόνι, ζει σε μια εντελώς ανοιχτή, ελεύθερη κοινωνία. Και θα ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω, κοιτάζοντας όλη αυτή τη διαδρομή των 70 χρόνων που καταγράψατε, πιστεύετε ότι κερδίζοντας την ορατότητα και την νομική ελευθερία, η queer κοινότητα έχασε καθόλου από εκείνη την υπόγεια, τη ρομαντική ένταση που περιγράφεται στο βιβλίο σας, όταν δεν ήταν ανοιχτά και ελεύθερα τα πράγματα και ήταν όλα μυστικά και ανίποτα?
That's a good question. Yes, I mean, I far prefer to live in a society in which queer people live in relative equality to others, and I think generally over my lifetime, the situation in Britain has been one of things getting better and better. The change of the law in 1967 was a big thing. The law changed overnight, but attitudes changed much more slowly. But I think you see this in all areas of public life. There are generational shifts in attitudes. There's, whether it's to do with sexuality or race or other form, the morality of behaviour. And different governments, brought in new legislation of securing equality for gay and lesbian people and trans people, now, of course, increasingly under threat. So that general picture has been sort of ameliorative. I think from the start, my first novel, The Swimming Pool Library, is narrated by a young man in 1983. Again, a handsome but a rather privileged young man, unlike David Spársoltl, who's really living through sex. He knows the world through sex, and he's brought face to face with a much older man who was born at the beginning of the century, and through reading his extracts from his diaries, he drops into these periods earlier in British queer history, and comes to understand something about the repressions, the cruelties of behaviour beforehand. So that sort of dichotomy between a disinhibited present and a past in which gay life was lived under much more severe social, moral constraints, I think is something that's always interested me. And it's true that for the novelist, there's perhaps more grist, more to work on if you're going back into a period where things are more conflicted. and conflict of one kind or another is obviously essential to a novel. And I think I have been drawn back repeatedly into these earlier periods when life was considerably more difficult for gay people. And it is partly a question of romance, I suppose. That long period of uncertainty, the tentative moves towards working out whether another person is amenable to what you're suggesting and so on, is very different from going on Grindr and just sort of finding 10 people within a radius of 100 yards. So there's a good deal more for me to work on in those earlier periods.
Λοιπόν, μου δίνετε μια εξαιρετική πάσα τώρα για να σας ρωτήσω. Έχετε αναφέρει σε διάφορες συνεντεύξεις σας ότι μεγαλώσατε σε μια μεσοαστική οικογένεια της επαρχίας που δεν μιλούσε ανοιχτά για τα συναισθήματα και ότι ποτέ δεν είπατε επίσημα στους γονείς σας για τον ερωτικό σας προσανατολισμό. Όταν όμως το 1988 εκδώσατε αυτό το καταπληκτικό βιβλίο, το συστήνω στο αναγνωστικό κοινό πραγματικά, τη βιβλιοθήκη της πισίνας, ένα βιβλίο που τότε σόκαρε, θα έλεγα, την συντηρητική Αγγλία με την τόλμη του. Υπήρξε λοιπόν εκείνη η στιγμή που νιώσατε ότι η λογοτεχνία έγινε γέφυρα για να σας καταλάβουν και οι δικοί σας άνθρωποι, χωρίς να χρειαστεί να υποθούν μεγάλες κουβέντες μεταξύ σας?
My poor mother, yes. I don't know. No, again, it's this thing of not talking about things. I think my father had picked up that I was gay quite early on, and we were once in the car together, and he said to me, any particular girlfriends at the moment, old chap? And I said, no, Dad. And he said, you're not really interested, are you? And I said, no, I'm not. So that was all that was ever said about it. So I don't think he was surprised by my first book, but I think my mother was rather shocked by it. I knew that if I was going to write this book, if I was going to do the things which I felt I really had to do, the thing that I sort of had in me that I had to get out, as it were, I could not think about what anybody else was going to think or feel about it. And looking back now, it does seem rather brutal of me to have exposed my parents. And I just didn't allow myself to think about those times when my mother would run into her friends in the supermarket or something, and they would say, what's all this about Alan's filthy book? Yeah, so that was, I think that's something I felt all along, that you just have to do what you have to do. And, you know, later it just became a completely accepted part of my life, and, you know, I took boyfriends home to stay with her, and she was often much more fond of them than I was, actually, so it was good.
Το ελληνικό κοινό, όπως είπαμε, πρόσφατα διάβασε και διαβάζει την υπόθεση Σπάρσολτ, αλλά στην βιβλιοθήκη της πισίνας που μιλήσαμε τώρα, γράψατε για μία εποχή που η γκέι ζωή στη Βρετανία ήταν παράνομη και πολύ γεμάτη κινδύνους. Σήμερα, στην υπόθεση Σπάρσολτ και στο Our Evenings, που πρόκειται να μεταφραστεί σύντομα, το περιμένουμε, κύριε Μπέκο, φτάνετε μέχρι την εποχή του, αν λέω σωστά, την πλατφόρμα Grindr και του γάμου των ομοφύλων. Πιστεύετε ότι αυτή είναι μία ερώτηση για μας που ασχολούμαστε με το βιβλίο πολύ σημαντική. Αν πιστεύετε ότι η λογοτεχνία βοήθησε στο να αλλάξει η κοινωνική πραγματικότητα ή απλώς κατέγραψε αυτή την αλλαγή?
I would love to think that literature had changed the social reality. I suppose it plays a small part. I mean, the number of people who read literary fiction is relatively small, but amongst them perhaps there are a lot of lawmakers, and so I mean, I don't know. But I've never really believed that. I've felt that I mean, who knows? As Shelley said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Perhaps in some tiny way. But I've never felt that was my duty. I felt myself not as a chronicler, because that suggests too keen a dedication to the facts, but of someone who was drawing a portrait of English social life in different periods. I think it's something about this technique of jumping between episodes, too, that you don't have to explain all these changes. And one of the things the reader will find when they arrive in a new section is that there's a subtly, or perhaps significantly different sort of moral atmosphere to that section than from the previous one. So you go, as you say, from a period of danger and illegality into one in which people are sort of acting completely freely. I don't need to spell out the social history, but it informs the whole background and sort of ethos of each section.
Πάντως, Γρηγόρη, εγώ θυμάμαι ότι όταν η γραμμή της ομορφιάς κέρδισε τον Booker, θεωρήθηκε μία ιστορική στιγμή για την queer λογοτεχνία, αλλά και γενικότερα για τη λογοτεχνία. Θυμάμαι μάλιστα ότι μετά ακολούθησαν αρκετά μυθιστορήματα σε αυτής της κατηγορίας, αν μπορούμε να την πούμε κατηγορία.
Εγώ νομίζω ότι τότε ήταν δύο τα πράγματα που κατέστησαν σημαντικό το βραβείο στον Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ. Το ένα ήταν ότι δεν περίμενε κανένας ένα βιβλίο με τέτοια θεματική να πάρει τον Booker, αφενός. Και το δεύτερο πολύ σημαντικό που συνέβη ήταν ότι πήρε τον Booker ένας τέτοιος συγγραφέας. Ένας συγγραφέας που έχει πολύ σπουδαίους, πώς να το πω, προγόνους. Μπορούμε να συζητήσουμε από τον Henry James μέχρι τον Forster και άλλους πολλούς. Είναι όμως ωραία η πάσα για την γραμμή της ομορφιάς. Θέλω να ρωτήσω εγώ τον Άλαν κάτι, αν συμφωνείτε. Το μυθιστόρημα αυτό, η γραμμή της ομορφιάς, θέλω να σταθώ λίγο στην πολιτική διάσταση, ας πούμε, γιατί θεωρώ ότι έχει και αυτή σημασία. Η γραμμή της ομορφιάς περιγράφει πολλά πράγματα. Πρωταγωνιστής εκεί είναι ο Μίκης, ο οποίος διασχίζει τις τάξεις και προσπαθεί να κάνει τη ζωή του όσο καλύτερα μπορεί. Περιγράφονται και οι δύο κυβερνήσεις της Θάτσερ με έναν καυστικό τρόπο. Και θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω τον Άλαν αν κάπως το πιο πρόσφατο βιβλίο του, που είναι του 2024, το Our Evenings, επειδή ακριβώς μεσολαβούν 20 χρόνια, εκεί υπάρχει, το βιβλίο είναι έντονα φορτισμένο ξανά, αυτή τη φορά όμως προσπαθώντας να ακτινογραφήσει πώς είναι η Βρετανική κοινωνία με το Brexit.
Βέβαια.
Δηλαδή, σε αυτά τα δύο βιβλία βλέπουμε τις δύο πολιτικές διαστάσεις πολύ ισχυρές. Και το ερώτημα είναι, αν το κάνει πολύ συνειδητά αυτό ή αν γίνεται πολιτικός επειδή δεν μπορεί να κάνει αλλιώς, δεν μπορεί να ξεφύγει από αυτό.
Και να συμπληρώσω ότι στη γραμμή της ομορφιάς, εγώ νομίζω ότι σας κυνηγάει πλέον το φάντασμα της Θάτσερ. Έχετε κάνει την ακτινογραφία της, πραγματικά.
Thatcher's ghost is haunting us all, yes. I mean, it was a radical change in British social and political life of a kind which was designed to endure. And it really shifted the whole framework. And so when we had a Labour government after John Major's government, the Conservative government which followed Thatcher's, he was more or less taking for granted sort of Thatcherite positions on all sorts of social issues. I mean, he did have a much more liberalising tendency, particularly in the sort of early administrations. So yeah, it was a change that we are, I think, still living with in many ways. I've never wanted to write about politics directly. Again, it's one of those things that I just don't feel I have a natural aptitude for. But I'm very fascinated by the way they permeate into society. And I suppose the line of beauty was my nearest approach to this. I mean, it comes up again in our evenings as well, but having a central character who is a Conservative MP and who is obsessed, as so many men in her orbit were, by her and whether he is going to receive her favour. And the absolute climax of his political career for Gerald, the MP, is when he dances with Mrs. Thatcher at his 25th wedding anniversary. Not when he dances with his devoted wife, but when he dances with the leader. And so it's, of course, very rather satirically offset by young Nick, the hero, full of cocaine, having the courage to go up to her and ask her to dance as well. I suspect when I do approach the political subject more nearly, I become rather more satirical than I do in other things. And in Our Evenings, which is a book narrated in the first person, it sort of offsets from teenage years two people, Dave Wynne, the central consciousness of the book, and this horrible boy that he is at school with, called Giles. And Giles isn't really a character in the same way that Dave is, and he's someone we forget about for long periods, but he's a sort of... He's an obstacle, a recurrent obstacle in Dave's life. He turns against his generous, wealthy, left-leaning, philanthropic parents. And by the end of the book, he's a sort of rabid Brexiteer and sort of far-right Tory politician. I'm not really interested in exploring the whole mentality of a far-right Tory politician. So I don't go into that in much detail. What I'm interested in is its impact on the world around him. So again, the last thing I wanted to do was to write a Brexit novel. You know, it would have been terribly depressing apart from anything else. Oddly, talking about it today, which is the 10th anniversary of the when we left. But I thought that the whole Brexit years could form a time frame for the book. So it opens in the early 1960s when the UK was making its first attempts to join the European community, and it ends not long after the fatal vote in 2016 to leave. So again, it's about the atmosphere, the sort of the larger atmosphere in which the main characters are doing their thing, you know, but their lives are going to be impinged on in a very important way by these other big questions.
Τώρα, όταν διαβάζει κανείς τα βιβλία σας, και αρχίζοντας και από το πρώτο βιβλίο, είναι δύσκολο να μην σκεφτεί, όπως είπε και ο Γρηγόρης, τον Φόρστερ, το περίφημο Μωρίς, και βεβαίως τον James Baldwin, θα έλεγα και εγώ, το δωμάτιο του Giovanni. Συγγραφείς που έγραψαν για την queer εμπειρία σε εποχές που ήταν πολύ πιο δύσκολες και πολύ πιο σκοτεινές. Αισθάνεστε ότι συνεχίζετε έναν διάλογο που ξεκίνησαν εκείνοι. Δηλαδή, πιάνετε καμιά φορά τον εαυτό σας όταν γράφετε να είστε σε έναν διάλογο μαζί τους.
Well, I mean, I think I am quite a literary writer, and I am a writer who, as well as trying to describe life as I know it and imagine it, is also in it. Yes, I think I am, you know, not, I hope, oppressively, but it's part of the way that I think and create. And, you know, there are various writers. I mean, Henry James is an important presence for me in the line of beauty. I feel often I'm I'm crossing the same territory that a writer like Forster or Henry James occupied, and I'm sort of tipping my hat to them. But I'm also doing all sorts of things which they couldn't do. When I was a graduate student at Oxford, I wrote a thesis about gay writers earlier in the century who had not been able to write openly about their sexuality and what this meant for their work, what the repression meant, and also the more or less cryptic ways in which they did express their sexuality, and wrote different kinds of book. And Forster was one of the writers I looked at then. Forster's case was very interesting because he died in 1970, and Morris came out the following year. And during his life, he had never publicly said that he was gay. And it's now absolutely axiomatic that he was gay, and people approach him, I think, in the knowledge that he was. But then, in those years, the early mid-70s, when I was sort of starting doing this work, nobody had really looked into this question at all. So yes, I had quite a conscious sense of working in their terrain and being very fascinated. And I suppose in a way that first book of the liberated, heedless young man and the more guarded, cautious old man, it's playing out that intergenerational pattern. And I think the intergenerational thing has been quite important in the books that I've written. The passing on of knowledge, the making sure that the young don't forget. It's very interesting how soon people do forget. And the AIDS crisis, which of course was the massive drama which preoccupied gay writers a lot through the 80s and 90s, which I didn't really address myself until I wrote The Line of Beauty. The Line of Beauty was recently staged. There was a theatrical version of it in London with a lot of the cast who'd been born long after the AIDS crisis, didn't really know anything about it. And you realise that I'm not setting myself up as a great educator, but you realise that actually a work of fiction is something which can pass on this knowledge to another generation which doesn't know about it. And I think perhaps particularly if you're talking about the history of a minority, then fiction does have a role in a sort of historical role to play.
Ήθελα να ρωτήσω τον Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ, να πω ότι προφανώς είναι πολύ σημαντικό αυτό το διαγενειακό στοιχείο στα βιβλία. Δεν είναι μόνο ότι περνάει η γνώση και η αντίληψη της κοινωνικής πραγματικότητας στους νεότερους. Είναι και, εγώ το βλέπω και σαν μια πράξη γνώσης μεν, αλλά αλληλεγγύης κιόλας μέσα σε συγκεκριμένες ομάδες ανθρώπων. Ήθελα να ρωτήσω κάτι σε σχέση με τους συγγραφείς, αυτούς τους σπουδαίους συγγραφείς που προηγήθηκαν. Αυτοί γράψανε με τον τρόπο που γράψανε, με αυτή την κρυπτικότητα, από ανάγκη. Ο ίδιος, μετά τα πρώτα βιβλία, τα οποία είναι πληθωρικά, έχουν μια αμεσότητα, για να το πω κωδικά, με ένα κωδικοποιημένο τρόπο, με συγχωρείτε, φαίνεται ότι στην ύστερη περίοδο τη δική του επιστρέφει, υιοθετεί τους τρόπους του έμμεσου, της κρυπτικότητας, της αμφισημίας. Και αυτό είναι μια επιλογή αισθητική, όχι, δεν είναι μια επιλογή ανάγκης, όπως υπήρξε σε αυτούς τους προηγούμενους. Και θέλω να μιλήσει λίγο, αν μπορεί, για αυτήν την αισθητική επιλογή επαναφοράς σε αυτούς τους τρόπους που, καλώς ή κακώς, στην λογοτεχνία που είναι απαιτητική, ταιριάζουν με έναν τρόπο περισσότερο.
Well, I think with the swimming pool library, I was very consciously tackling this subject of gay life, which the change in the law in 1967 has sort of made all sorts of things possible, as we were saying just now. And nobody had really written a novel which embraced these new opportunities. And I knew that I wanted to write a book which sort of connected up different areas of gay experience. The private, the sexual, the cultural. So there's a lot in the book about Forster, indeed, and Benjamin Britten and Ronald Furbank, another British queer author I've been very interested in for 50 years. The sexual element had tended to be sort of fenced off before, and if you wanted to read about men having sex with each other, you did so either in works of pathology or criminal literature, or in pornography. And I wanted to sort of stir it all in and make it part of the larger picture. And as I said, to have this novel narrated by someone who's living his whole life through sort of sexual excitement. So that was a very conscious part of the design of the book. And it was a curious thing that when I started writing it at the beginning of 1984, and during the time I was writing it, the whole world that I was writing about changed radically because of the onset of AIDS. And so I had to sort of make a decision as to whether the book would reflect this dramatic, terrible occurrence or not. And in the end decided not to, and the book is set in 1983. But anybody who was reading it when it came out in 1988 would already be seeing it through this extraordinary change which had happened in the preceding years. And in a way, the book had become historical in a way that I could never have imagined, you know. And I think there was some feeling that, I remember some reviews saying it was irresponsible to write about this sort of sexual free-for-all in the current, as if fiction was a kind of guide to present-day etiquette or something. You know, it was. But actually, I felt it was more because there was an atmosphere of a sort of backlash against gay people and hostility to gay violence against gays happening at the same time as the AIDS crisis. I felt it was all the more important to be defiant about the sort of sexual aspects of the book. And sex itself had become very politicized as part of gay liberation, and claiming the right to do what you wanted sexually was a key thing. So I think that was all in there, and so I wrote in this very frank way about it, which thrilled some people, appalled others. But I didn't want to carry on doing that all the time, and I think I've never wanted to repeat myself. You know? And yes, so there's been as you say, there's been a sort of tapering off. It is perhaps partly an aesthetic choice, but also, as we were saying earlier, an increasing interest in the mystery of other people's lives. I mean, The Stranger's Child, for instance, there's the first part of the book set just before the First World War. There's a sort of secret relationship going on between two young men. They know what's going on, but nobody else does, really. And then after one of them is killed in the war, what do we know about them? The whole thing could be completely covered up, or can it be explored, investigated in some way? And I became quite interested then in the sort of unknowable mystery of what goes on. And it was perhaps a reaction against the great frankness that I'd sort of been pursuing earlier.
Τώρα μου δώσατε μια εξαιρετική πάσα και οι δύο, γιατί θέλω να πάμε ένα βήμα παραπέρα τη συζήτηση, ουσιαστικά για την ίδια την τέχνη του μυθιστορήματος. Και αναρωτιέμαι αν νιώθετε ότι αυτές οι ταμπέλες που συνήθως βάζουμε στη λογοτεχνία, λέμε queer λογοτεχνία, λέμε αστυνομική λογοτεχνία, θεωρείτε ότι πλέον έχετε φύγει από αυτή την κατηγορία και έχει ανοίξει το κοινό, το αναγνωστικό κοινό σας, ή ποια είναι η γνώμη σας για τις ταμπέλες που βάζουμε, γιατί πάνω απ' όλα και πριν απ' όλα η δική σας λογοτεχνία είναι εξαιρετική λογοτεχνία.
Well, I mean, my feeling was that gay literature in particular became a thing in those years of the 80s and 90s, and it had a political purpose. It was celebrating liberation, it was claiming new freedoms, and it had a sort of, a great variety of work was produced, but it had a sort of collective purpose somehow. And I think all the social changes we were describing earlier, that purpose was diluted. I don't mean that queer life won't continue to be extremely interesting to write about. One of the things that the writing of the Swimming Pool Library taught me, which I was just describing about how it came out into a different atmosphere from the one in which I started writing it, was that if I was going to be writing about queer life, I was writing about a live subject, something which was constantly changing, and which, of course, was going on into phases then in the future, which I've written about since. So it's a kind of adventure. And, but the actual status of queer writing, I think, has changed. It did. I don't want to cast myself as a lonely pioneer. I mean, there was quite a lot of queer writing going on, and in England there were 2 or 3 presses. There was one called the Gay Men's Press, for instance, which published work by gay men, really for a gay readership, which was fine. But I think I did always have a larger ambition than that, and I hoped to reach a wider readership and kind of blow the thing open a bit. So I liked it when gay and lesbian sections were introduced in bookshops. I liked to be in the gay and lesbian section, but I also liked to be in the general fiction section. And I think it was a desire to break down the sort of ghettoization of literature. When everybody was startled by a gay novel winning the Booker, I thought, I've been doing this for years. It wasn't. There was nothing. Having decided at the beginning that I was going to write books from a gay point of view, and just take that for granted, don't apologise, don't explain, but that's what I'm doing. So it was rather perplexing to suddenly be taken aback by the fact that I think there was one article, I think it was in the Daily Express, a rubbishy right-wing newspaper, just said, "Gay sex wins Booker," which I thought, if only it were that easy. Yes, but you have to make a story out of these things, I suppose. But the press has to take a line on them. So I think it's always been the sort of the donné, the large general area which I'm going to be investigating, but I don't consider that what I write is limited by this, and nor do I think that queer people just go around being madly queer the whole time. They're going off to work and going to visit their mother and doing the garden, and they're living their ordinary lives like anybody else. And I think that is a duality in a way which I've always enjoyed. That the queer people are exceptional. They belong to a sort of complex minority. But they're also just like everybody else. And the normality of queerness is, I think, something I've always wanted to write about too.
Αυτό που θα ήθελα να προσθέσω είναι στη σύγχρονη λογοτεχνία που έχει γκέι θεματική ή queer θεματική, γίνεται πάρα πολύς λόγος για το τραύμα, πώς διαχειριζόμαστε το τραύμα. Ακολουθούμε την οδό της μυθοπλασίας, ακολουθούμε την οδό της αυτομυθοπλασίας, της μαρτυρίας. Αυτή είναι μια τάση πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα. Εγώ όμως ήθελα να σταθώ σε κάτι που κάνει ο Hollinghurst στο τελευταίο βιβλίο. Ο κεντρικός ήρωας στο τελευταίο βιβλίο, ο Dave, ο οποίος είναι μεικτής καταγωγής, δηλαδή έχει μητέρα Αγγλίδα και πατέρα από την Βυρμανία, είναι μηγάδας, μηγάς. Αυτό που παρακολουθούμε είναι έναν άνθρωπο που έχει τραυματικές εμπειρίες, αλλά είναι ένας τύπος ο οποίος μέχρι το τέλος επιδιώκει να βλέπει τη ζωή θετικά, διεκδικεί την αγάπη, δεν στέκεται στο τραύμα. Θεωρώ ότι το μυθιστόρημα του Hollinghurst, το πιο πρόσφατο, δείχνει και έναν άλλον δρόμο. Χωρίς να λέω ότι η καταγραφή, όλα τα άλλα δεν έχουν ενδιαφέρον. Αλλά θα ήθελα να μας μιλήσει λίγο γι' αυτό. Γιατί εκτός από αυτόν, υπάρχει και η μητέρα του, που επίσης χτίζει ένα είδος διαφορετικής ζωής με τη δική της σύντροφο. Δηλαδή, είναι άνθρωποι που έχουν τραύματα, αλλά που δεν τους καταβάλουν αυτά.
That's a very interesting point, and you're quite right that that was central to my idea of this book. Dave, the narrator, has an English mother and a Burmese father whom he never meets. And he's born in 1947. So his mother has worked briefly as a secretary in Rangoon and has then come back to England pregnant, gives birth, she's living in this very conventional little rural town, gives birth to this sort of brown-faced child. So they are sort of outsiders in this community. And I read the book in the first person because I'd long wanted to try an approach as a white person, the experience of the period I've lived through, as it might have been experienced by someone who is in many ways like me, but who also has this undisguisable difference of race. And I saw that there was a danger in such a project, in writing a book which was just a list of grievances, aggressions, micro and macro aggressions. And Dave, indeed, is subject to various kinds of verbal and physical abuse at various times. His whole life is coloured by perceptions of his race. But it was very important to me that he should not be a victim. He's a very intelligent, creative, perceptive person. And because the book is written in the first person, of course, you need your narrator to be someone who can do all this observing and reacting for you. And I wanted him to be someone who the reader comes to like a lot and to be engaged by, obviously to feel sympathy for, in the insults and so on that he is receiving. But to have a positive attitude and belief, self-belief. He becomes an actor. He has great success as a student, as an actor. And when he leaves university and goes out into the world, he ought to be able to start a career as a marvellous classical actor. But because of his race, the only parts he can get are little tiny racially stereotyped roles in terrible sitcoms and things. He's grown up inside. He wins a scholarship to a private school. He wins a scholarship to Oxford. He's sort of grown up inside the establishment. But then he realizes there's no longer any place for him in the establishment. He can't fulfill himself within that context. So he joins an alternative theatre group, putting on kind of radical versions of the classics as well as new plays, travelling around the country. And this theatre group is a little kind of microcosm of outsiders. It's racially very mixed, sexually very, very mixed too. And they travel round. They're a sort of free-floating group outside the confines of the kind of establishment structures. His mother, after he goes away to boarding school, with whom he's always shared his evenings, is left by herself. She's a dressmaker. So as well as having this slightly ambiguous status, she also has this rather intimate access to women in the town for whom she's making new suits and skirts and so forth. And Dave, when he comes home in the holidays, is increasingly aware that there's this other woman in the town, a rather overwhelming divorcee called Mrs. Croft, who's taking up more and more of his mother's time. And I hope the reader is a step or two ahead of Dave as they read the story. He is so caught up in his own adolescent sort of hormonal excitements that he's slow to realize that actually this serious relationship is developing between his mother and another woman. And Mrs. Croft is a very self-confident character. And I think Dave's mother has great strength of character, determination. And after Dave leaves school, the two women set up home together. And they too are a sort of alternative bubble in this house on the outskirts of this very conventional little community. And they're just getting on with doing their thing. So I liked that. Again, it's this sort of defiant and optimistic attitude to seizing your own freedom and disregarding as far as possible the things people say against you.
Φτάνοντας προς το τέλος αυτής της συνάντησης, συνομιλίας, θα ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω κάτι έξω από την λογοτεχνία. Ζούμε σε περίεργους καιρούς. Θεωρητικά έχουμε κατακτήσει πολλά δικαιώματα. Υπάρχει θεωρητικά ισότητα και ισονομία. Και οι άνθρωποι θεωρητικά στις δυτικές κοινωνίες μπορούν να έχουν ελεύθερο σεξουαλικό προσανατολισμό. Πόσο αληθινά είναι όλα αυτά τα θεωρητικά που περιέγραψα πριν?
Well, I was speaking a while ago about this pattern of general improvement and everything getting better and better. And of course, we're coming, I think, at the moment to see extremely worrying reversals of this situation as the rights of minorities of all kinds are sort of re-politicized by the right, and the far right in particular. I think things are much worse at the moment in the United States, obviously, with its sort of nakedly racist policies of this administration. The attack from the start of this administration on trans people, the constant threat of the withdrawal of various rights like gay marriage and so forth. So all these hard fought for rights, I think, are now feeling vulnerable to assault. And you know, you're quite naturally talking about the Western world and the freedoms that we enjoy here. But these freedoms, insofar as they exist at all, are being reduced even further in other communities. You know, for instance, in West African countries, you know, terrible new laws being brought in Ghana, Cameroon, really retrograde civic situation for queer people. You see it in Soviet, in Russia, and so forth. So I think it's an alarming movement generally, and it's part of a much larger sort of shift to the right that's going on. And it will be, if I'm still writing books in 10 years' time, it will be interesting and possibly alarming to see what that next jump forward will have brought us to.
Μπορούμε να περάσουμε και σε ερωτήσεις από το κοινό. Αν έχετε κάποιες ερωτήσεις προς τον Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ, στο μεταξύ, μια τελευταία ερώτηση που θα ήθελα εγώ να σας κάνω είναι ποια θεωρείτε γενικώς τη μεγαλύτερη σύγκρουση, μιας και η θεματική του φεστιβάλ είναι κόσμοι σε σύγκρουση, που βλέπετε στις σύγχρονες κοινωνίες μας. Είναι πολλών ειδών οι συγκρούσεις. Ποια εσείς θεωρείτε πιο απειλητική για το ανθρώπινο είδος?
I'm not sure I can really answer that. I'm just a novelist.
Είναι πολλές.
I mean, I think everybody is so alarmed and nauseated by what's happening in America at the moment, which is the contempt for the rule of law, the contempt for international law, the wholesale removal of public freedoms of various kinds. But you know, there are obviously actual armed conflicts of terrifying nature going on in certain parts of the world. I don't quite know how to compare them. Some involve, you know, incessant, appalling loss of life, destruction of societies, habitats, etc. Those in the Western world tend to be operating still at a slightly different level. But this festival is very justly titled. We live in a world of much greater conflict than any since I was born.
Υπάρχει κάποιο χέρι που δεν βλέπουμε εμείς από εδώ? Όχι. Βλέπεις?
Δεν υπάρχει κάποια ερώτηση. Νομίζω ότι σας καλύψαμε. Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ τον Άλαν Χόλινγκχερστ για τη συμμετοχή σε αυτό το φεστιβάλ. Είναι μεγάλη μας τιμή να είναι ανάμεσά μας. Και βέβαια τον Γρηγόρη Μπέκο για αυτή την ωραία εκδήλωση. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
It's been a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Επίσης, τελειώνοντας, θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω πολύ τους διερμηνείς μας και για την μετάφραση και να πω ότι θα έχουμε υπογραφές ακριβώς έξω από την αίθουσα. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.